This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Herbin Vert de Gris. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, as well as checking out the writing sample that I did earlier on 20-pound copy paper. I'll compare Herbin Vert de Gris to some similar inks from my collection, and finally I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. Herbin Vert de Gris came off the nib of my glass dip pen nice and uniformly, but it did feel pretty dry. The swatch that I did with my tweezers was fairly crisp, but it was also pretty uniform in color. There doesn't appear to be any sheen. The ink also appears somewhat grainy in the lighter sections of the swatch. I'm going to begin with the FaberCastell Ambition with an extra fine stainless steel nib. Just the slightest bit of feedback. Overall, pretty smooth for this pen. I'm just gonna put nice, but it's very nice. And I like the look of this color with my flamingo colored pen. I think they look good together. Next, I'll be writing with my Platinum 3776 with a 14 karat fine nib. You can see that the line that this Platinum puts down, this Platinum Fine, is quite a bit finer than the Ambition Extra Fine, and there's quite a bit of feedback, and it's just because this is such a fine nib. I'm going to put OK on this one. Next, I've got my TWSBI Mini with a stainless steel fine nib. And that is very smooth. Next, I'll be writing with my Platinum 3776 with a 14 karat medium nib. I have been very spoiled by this pen and ink combination. I've really enjoyed all the writing samples that I've done with it so far, and normally I prefer to buy bottles of inks that perform well in a wide variety of pens and nibs. This ink has been, good in some, unpleasant in others. But I'm considering getting a little bottle of this just because I love it so much in this pen with this nib. And that's one of the things I like about the little Herbin inks that come in the little 10 ml bottles. That's just perfect for me if I want to get a bottle just to use with one pen. There's some feedback with this nib, but it's mostly just sound. It's not in any way scratchy. Just enough feedback to make it pleasant on the page, and I kind of enjoy the sound, the little scritchy scratchy sound on the page if it feels pleasant when I'm writing. Next, I've got a Pilot Pluminix with a stainless steel cursive medium nib. It looks a little bit dry, but it didn't feel dry, surprisingly. A lot of times with this nib, it'll feel dry with some inks, but this was actually, it felt very smooth, even though it looks kind of dry. It's a little bit, a lot of the pale shades are what show up, but this was smooth. Next, I've got my Quebeco AL Sport with a double broad stainless steel nib. Very smooth and very pleasant to write with. I've enjoyed writing with this on all the papers that I've tried it on. And finally, I've got my Ginhow X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. That was glassy smooth, but surprisingly dry. And I noticed as I was writing, it looks, I'm not seeing a lot of the shading that I did in some of the other nibs. It looks kind of flat, and that's just because this particular nib with this ink is writing kind of dry. But it felt nice. Okay, while this dries, we'll take a look at the copy paper. Okay, on the 20-pound copy paper, maybe you can see that Herbin Vert de Gris is quite different in color from Rohr & Klinger Vert de Gris. Vert de Gris is more of a blue, a dark teal, and Vert de Gris is kind of a greenish gray. And where Vert de Gris felt pretty nice in most of the nibs, on poor quality paper, Vert de Gris just, it wasn't pleasant to use really in any of the nibs, except for the AL Sport was pretty smooth, and I guess the stub nib felt okay, but it just seemed like you could see the ink spreading. This ink is really watery and it soaks into the page really quick, and that's what made all the rest of these finer nibs just feel unpleasant. The ink, you can see where the ink soaked in so quickly, and so it just feels like you're writing on wet paper, which is unpleasant. Here's Vert de Gris. That wet ink, like I mentioned, soaks into the paper pretty quickly and then soaks through. Not a great ink for poor quality paper, but in my Leuchtturm, I really enjoyed this ink. It looked much nicer in the stub nib, much nicer on this Leuchtturm paper than it did on the smoother Tomoe River paper, and I enjoyed writing with the smaller nibs on this paper as well. In pictures, when I looked at Herbin Vert de Gris, it wasn't really a color that spoke to me, but I believe I picked it up just to compare it to Rohr & Klinger Vert de Gris, and you can see they are two very different ink colors, as I mentioned before. An ink from my collection that is a little more comparable, though, is Kobe number 68, the West Pearl Blue. But I think I like Vert de Gris more. It's just enough darker that I enjoy using it in my pens. And the reading back what you've written, just is a little bit easier on the eyes. Surprisingly, Lyrebird Green was closer than I thought it would be. But I've mentioned before, I don't know if you get a bottle of Lyrebird Green, if this is what color it's going to be, or if it's more green. Maybe there was something wrong with this batch, but I do like this. But Lyrebird Green is a little more kind of a smoother ink. Vert de Gris, you feel a little more feedback of the nib on the paper. Now, Herbin Vert de Gris is described many places as a greenish gray, but when I look at Vert de Gris next to kind of a greenish gray ink, Herbin Vert Atlantide, it's kind of a sagey green. It makes it look a little more light blue. But then when I look at it compared to Waterman Mysterious Blue, it makes it look more green. It's one of those weird color changing inks depending on what you're comparing it to. In the water resistance test for Vert de Gris, it's got a very strong gray water resistant component, so everything turned out very legible. Even this little bit that I tried to do a little reverse writing with the FaberCastell Ambition, everything is very legible. Very little greenish blue ink lifted up off the paper when I put it in the water. Okay, and the writing sample that I did on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, nothing even came close to bleeding through. Less show through than you typically see in some of my darker inks that I like to use. No sheen. Some nice subtle shading. Like I mentioned, there's not a big range from the dark end of the swatch to the light end, but in that Quebeco double broad, I like the shading that you get. And after it dried, you get some shading in the 1.5 stub, though there's more light in there than I would like to see. I like this Quebeco writing sample where you get more of the dark. The Pilot Pluminix was a drier writer, so that's another one where you're getting more of the lighter shades. My favorite, though, is the Medium Platinum. It's mostly darker shades with just a few bits of the lighter shades. It looks like its namesake. I don't use my Platinum 3776 very much anymore, other than just writing samples and testing inks. But this ink just performed so well with this medium nib that it's got me kind of excited about using this pen again. This is kind of a boring pen, and I've always kind of thought of this ink as a boring ink, but these two together, I don't know, I think it maybe has kind of a vintage vibe to me, which kind of makes me excited to use it. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.